gym has a drop flag. Someone donated that to us in there. Those were things that, you know, if I were a taxpayer out there, I'd say that's probably a little extreme, isn't it, using my money for those sort of items. So what you see then is layout, and we'll talk about that as we tour through. Any questions? I think I've tried to tell you now a little bit on the importance of planning a facility from start to finish, setting things up the way you want to do them, making sure that they fit sequentially, and then site is huge. Getting that way in advance. If we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have had the ins and outs, because you know everyone around you are forced into accesses. This guy here is going to be forced to make his accesses if he has them, and across the way the same thing, because they say we're not going to stagger him. This guy here can't come in here and you come in here. So we've determined for them already that they're set. We got the first, you know, playing by our rules, and our footprint was approved. Everyone around us is going to play into where it fit for us, right or wrong. This guy here is teasing me the other day. They're going to have 400 homes there. He said, well, you know, it's nice that you got all your stuff, because now I get to go back and redesign all of mine to fit, you know, your ins and outs. And I said, oh, Thomas, that'll work great for you. But, you know, had we not done this, I'd have done with him. Wherever his were, I'd have made mine, and maybe I wouldn't be able to get these two spots. Okay, questions?
Yeah, I have two. One is there any sort of strategic idea behind tilting the area C?
Auditorium.
The auditorium?
Yeah.
Is there some I can't think of it. I'm trying to,
Why we did that at an angle. We did that for two reasons. One is that if we straightened that thing out, we'd be over here and we'd be right up against that access. Okay. We wanted that access to go to give these separate. So there was one reason. The second one was I only wanted this thing so large, but I wanted a little bit of extra flow into the kitchen area where they line up. Okay. Oh. So there's your second thing, is it gave me a nice wide area where they go into the kitchen. And the third piece is that it fit from the perspective of spacing in the front and the spanning in here, that they said, you know, structurally it's a little cheaper here than to make that line up. So that was done for those three reasons.
Cool. And then I noticed coming in that there's actual walkways from the church into the football area. Was there some sort of process that you had to work with them to say, hey, you're like some sort of cross-access agreement, or? Yep. Or did you have to pay for that, or were they like, yeah, sure, go for it?
The church bought that ground right after we bought our ground, and they said in no uncertain terms is, you know, we want you guys to work with us. And so we told them up front that where they're going to seminary in the mornings, we needed, you know, a proper path from theirs to ours. And so they paid for the sidewalk and the ramp, even though it's on our ground and attaches to theirs. We're going to have them fence it all the way along too, so that they make them use that. So it was through agreement of the church working with us to make it work.
Cool. I don't have a question so much as a thought, in that we talked earlier about the market and how that was an advantage for your district.
Yeah.
Saved you a lot of money. Another thing that was a great advantage, and I'm sure you've already talked about, is the fact that the number of large high schools that went up just prior to your construction, you were able to learn from mistakes made by Caldwell, Valley View, all of those other schools. And so sometimes we think, oh, we got to get this bond passed, we got to get it passed. Well, sometimes waiting is actually an advantage, because while you're waiting, other districts are making mistakes that you can learn from.
Yeah, you know, Angie, but we didn't use just this one. I went in actually 4 other states. I went to the state of Washington, and went to the Seattle area. I went through all their big schools, and I flew even into California and looked at schools there. A lot of times Idaho doesn't get the same thing that the state of Washington has, money they put into schools. So they're even more explicit on their schools of what they allow and what they don't, because up to 80% of their school can be funded with the state. So I learned much more from them than I did here, and you're right, I learned because Caldwell's footprint was what I was going to use. I wanted that, you know, changed, but I'll show you in the stairwells. I went out on Bremerton Island, there's a new high school there, state-of-the-art high school. They have a lot of money there, it's like a Sun Valley, their school was 78 million or something there. I learned from them, you know, these are frills in my mind, but they had a deal that came down each stairwell that was impressive for me, called a storefront. And so we did that on ours, where every stairwell we divide, because what kids do is they'll come down the stairwell and they'll go down the opposite side, and in the middle of that is a real congestion area, similar to what you guys have in front of your corridor. So we learned from them, and it wasn't real expensive, but that was another thing that, you know, I put on all of our stairwells, goes clear to the ceiling there, making kids come down and go the way they want to go, pushing them into the flow better. But you're right, and if you don't take the time to do that, timing wise, yeah, they'd had it. If they hadn't have built around here, though, I would have gone, you know, other states. But
I think that's an important thing to think
Yeah.
about when you're
Yeah,
designing
it
and
is.
planning your building, is to go and look at other
Yeah.
buildings and learn from what they've done.
And the key to what you're saying is this, Angie, if you don't force an architect to do that, which I did, you know, I'd take the architects with me and say, you know what, I'm going to Seattle, I'd like you to go with me. They won't do that, because the architects are just like anyone else, like us. You know, we're set and think that we were trained to do the thing, and the architects can have the attitude. And I worked with architects doing consulting work during my times off. There's some real egotistical architects that say, you know, I'm designing the thing my way or the highway. And I look through some of these schools, unfortunately, and there's a lot of bells and whistles in those that they wouldn't design in my schools. And they're putting a lot of expense into things that Rocky Mountain has cement hallways all the way through that. The aesthetics of that looks nice, but is $15 million worth of extra, you know, expense or this or that for as net usable important? It is to me. They go down those corridors I do. If you walk down Rocky Mountains, and the principal's a nice guy, lives right over here by us, Mike toured me through, and he says, here's the problems with our school, Rich. We ran out of money. We have no vestibules. Vestibule means double sets of doors on the ends. The acoustics got all taken out, so we have cement corridors everywhere, including their library is solid cement. That has no sound resistance at all. You know, cement is terrible. And so those are the sort of things you learn from, and unfortunately he got shorted on their budget because, as you say, Wendy, Meridian passed a bond and they said, you know, we're doing 5 projects. Rocky Mountain, here's your money. So quality, quantity, cost. You know, they had, the costs were there, the quality was what suffered, because the quantity had to be there with that many rooms. So that 3 legs of stool is important. You're right, that's an important part of it.
Could I add something on the planning portion? Kind of overlooked. We didn't really talk about it. When we budget and estimate initially, you don't ever know what the building type is going to be. So you kind of look at it, what are the history? We don't have any control. This building could have been all CMU or concrete masonry units or structural steel, or there's all different ones. So you look at it, okay, what could it be? You don't know. Through the planning process, what this was developed, and when we looked at the schedule, when it was going to be started, when it was going to be bid, you look at what you can do in warm weather when the weather's good, and when it's cold. Cold weather protection is a big cost. You don't get to recuperate. This building was, this long portion is a structural steel frame, and then these tall walls around the gymnasium and the auditorium are masonry. The masonry was worked on in the summer, and the foundation, so these got started first. The foundation's poured. As the fall and winter come up, arrive, these walls are up, and you can start working on the roof system. This underground and all these areas came second. Structural steel doesn't, you don't have to protect it in the winter. We're masonry, we have to cure. So we were able to get ahead of the curve, and the way that the project was put together with consideration of the schedule and the construction time also adds to savings for the cost of the building. So those are some of the areas that, with the planning that go in, you really want to look at all different angles. And the architects on this particular project, very receptive to suggestions and saying, okay, I agree, you can, let's do it this way, and that's the way the building was designed and it wasn't needed to be adjusted. We've been on some projects where it's very difficult to